3, 2, 1. What is up, you guys? Welcome to Real Talks. It's been forever since I put out any sort of content, and it's actually fitting that this video is coming out when it is, and that's because right now it's May, and May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And mental health happens to be one of the reasons as to why I've been away for such a long time. And before we really jump into it, I just wanted to say that I by no means am a mental health expert, and that there's so many complexities that are involved with mental health that I can't even begin to explain them all. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to share with you guys the condensed version of how I view mental health and where I've been and what I've been up to over the past year and some change. And hopefully at the end of it, you'll be more inclined to take a better look into your own mental health. It's important for me to talk about mental health today for a few reasons that I'm sure many people can kind of relate to. And that first reason is that historically, men have had a difficult time talking about their mental health, and that has gone on for ages. There's this old-timey notion that men have to be able to flawlessly handle everything that comes their way, and that real men don't have emotions, or that men shouldn't talk about their feelings or the things that are bothering them. Now, while I am a huge believer in being a tough SOB to some degree so that you can handle what most of the world has to throw at you, I am not a believer in the toxic mentality where people struggle in silence because it's what's expected of them, or that they view mental health as a weakness, or they find it emasculating. The second reason I wanted to have this conversation is that in certain communities, for example, brown communities, Desi, Asian, Middle Eastern, Muslim communities, mental health is not discussed nearly enough. And this leads to so many people who don't know how to talk about it, who don't know how to be there for someone, who don't know what the red flags are like. They may not even realize that they themselves are dealing with some mental health issues in the first place. And ultimately, it leads to more people struggling in silence and continuing a cycle that does not need to exist. Now, the third reason why I wanted to have this real talk is that my generation ended up being the transitional generation. Around the time we were coming of age, talking about mental health became a lot more common. But I remember the times that preceded that. People that were struggling with mental health, whether it was somebody themselves or somebody else that they knew, they were seen as weak, flawed. They were treated as if they had some sort of contagious sickness and that we were supposed to generally stay away from those people. These notions couldn't have been further from the truth. And even though we got to be that transitional generation, old mentalities and old notions die hard. And no one wants to be viewed by their peers or even themselves as weak or insufficient. And mental health doesn't just apply to these three groups that I just mentioned before. I'd go so far as to say that mental health is something that everyone deals with, and it is absolutely normal to have to deal with it. Now, I want to do a quick demo with you guys. There are so many different ways to try and visualize mental health, but what I'm about to show you is just one hyper-simplified way to view things in a sea of many viewpoints and many different experiences. This is just one way to look at it, and it might actually help you understand the complexities that go into mental health, but I'm going to try to keep it really, really simple. This is a balancing physics toy, and this little guy right here is you. More specifically, this little guy represents your mental health at any given point in time. And believe it or not, this little guy, just like yourself, is very good at finding balance. And that's because this guy's done it hundreds of times, day to day, for years and years, and he has years worth of experience balancing himself in his day-to-day life. Now, for simplicity's sake, let's designate sides. This side will be the positive side, where this little guy deals with positive emotions, positive events, positive stimulus, etc., etc. And in the same token, this side will be the negative side. Now, remember when I said that we're really good at finding balance? Well, that's because we do many different micro-balancing adjustments hundreds of times in our day-to-day lives for the majority of our lives. And based on 100 different factors, including our environment, the people we associate with, our lived experience, the type of human beings that we are, so on and so forth, we begin to develop a bit of a range in which we're really, really good at finding balance. For visualization's sake, let's run through a super simplified and easy to digest example. Let's just say one day you're running late and there's traffic on the way to work. That little bit of stimulus pulls you slightly into the negative. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, let's just say you were able to grab a cup of coffee from your favorite coffee shop, and it's absolutely everything you need right now. And on top of that, the weather is good, the sun is shining, and you're playing your favorite tunes in your car on the way to work. All of these things combine to give you some momentum right here on the positive side, and it brings you right back into balance just like that. Now again, I want you to remember this is a super simplified example to help you visualize mental health. Mental health is way more complex than just some positive and negative stimuli counteracting each other. But this balancing act that we do is really interesting because, as you can expect, there will be times where stimulus pushes us past our normal range. And that's when things start acting a little bit differently. We begin to feel things more intensely. We begin to react to things differently. And that goes for either side of this balancing act. When we have heavyweight stimulus on the positive side, those big moments in our lives, those milestone moments, for example, graduating, buying a home, getting married, having kids, etc., we feel those moments intensely and they do carry a lot of weight. But what you might have noticed is that those heavyweight positive moments leave lasting impressions and create memories, but the stimulus caused by those moments is often fleeting, meaning they don't last very long. So what ends up happening is that after some heavyweight positive stimulus, we end up coming back to our balance point pretty quickly. Another way to view this is to think about a roller coaster. You start off at a particular point, you slowly build your way up to the top, and then you get this sudden surge rush, and before you know it, you'll be right back to where you started. Now, when we're pushed past the range on our negative side, we once again feel all that stimulus intensely. And the heavyweight scenarios on this side can be something like losing someone because of a death or the end of a relationship. It can be dealing with an injury. It can be an event that causes you to fear for your life. It can be even making a mistake. All of these kinds of stimulus affect us deeply, and it pushes us past our normal balance range. In fact, sometimes it feels that every degree of change in the negative direction gets exponentially heavier and heavier, which in turn pulls you down even more. And this can make the decline into the negative feel sudden. Or in the same scenario, let's just say someone puts off dealing with the stimuli, compartmentalizes it, bottles it all up. It could conversely end up being a slow, unknowing descent into the negative zone. And when you're in the negative zone, it feels like there's a weight that's pulling you down. It's a very tricky predicament to be in because sometimes when we don't deal with the things that are pulling us down appropriately, we adapt in other ways. We end up just being better at carrying the weight instead of dealing with the predicament that's causing that imbalance in the first place, which can be good in some respects and bad in others. But we never really truly come back to that balance point. But we've tricked ourselves into believing that we're there. So since we've tricked ourselves into this false balance point, we end up leaning our scale slightly towards the negative at the very end of our range, extremely susceptible to any other negative stimulus that can set off a chain of events that will continue to pull us lower and lower. And you might have guessed it, maybe from personal experience or maybe from seeing someone else go through it, but once we dip past our normal range on the negative side, it takes us a lot longer to come back to the balance point. And this is kind of the reason why heavy-hitting negative stimulus events can affect us for so long. Think of dealing with a loss. Think of dealing with trauma. It's never a quick, straightforward, linear procedure. The journey back to baseline is a really long, wobbly process with many moments teetering on the verge of declining even further, trying to find balance, trying to find stability, trying to push back against this downward pulling pressure. Now, I'm the type of person that likes to learn through visuals and examples, so hopefully my super simplified breakdown was easy enough to understand and hopefully you were able to take away something from it. But if I lost you at any point along the line, there's still one solid takeaway even if you didn't understand any of what I just said. And that is mental health is an absolutely complex thing to deal with. There's so many factors and variables that are involved. And it is undoubtedly difficult dealing with mental health situations, but it's equally difficult trying to talk about it, trying to explain to someone where you're coming from. So whenever you're dealing with a mental health situation, whether it is your own or someone else's, remember to approach that subject with a little bit of compassion. It's a difficult predicament to deal with, and everyone deals with it in their own ways. Now, as for my particular experience, we got to run it back to the tail end of 2019. That particular moment in time was an absolutely amazing time for me. I'd figured out what I wanted to do for my professional career, what I wanted to do as a passion project. I had a really good job. I was working on who I was as a human being. I was going to the gym regularly. I was making power moves. And if you look back to one of the videos that me and a buddy of mine, Carl, shot, we were talking about the end of the year and how excited we were for the new year and the upcoming decade and all the things we wanted to accomplish. Unfortunately, when 2020 rolled around, it brought along tragedy. It started off with little whispers of a virus all the way across the world, and as it crept closer and closer to home, everyone started to freak the fuck out. And we saw the sheer madness unfold when people were bombarding supermarkets just trying to rack up on supplies. People were legitimately having fistfights over toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and you can kind of start to see how people's mental health was being affected by the global pandemic. Now, with a lot of the most stressful things in life, you have to be able to adapt, and I pride myself on being able to adapt to all kinds of situations. But when I try to adapt to something, it's usually trying to adapt to get stronger, to learn something, to be more efficient, to be a better person. But this was a different kind of adaptation entirely. This was an adaptation necessary for survival. So me and so many other people out there went into this survival mode. And when you're in that mode, all the leisurely things that you like to do, all the things you like to do for fun, all the things you do for yourself, all the activities that you're interested in, and all the other non-essential functions get packed up in a box and stored in the back of your head. Because the only thing that you're focused on is trying to make it out of a tough situation in one piece. And that survival mode mentality can be applied to so many of the scenarios and situations and not just the pandemic itself. Now, a pandemic itself is an extremely difficult mental stressor to deal with. You're trying to survive. You're trying not to get sick. You're trying not to get anyone around you sick. You're trying not to lose anyone in the process. It's a very difficult thing to deal with on its own. But during this time, so many other things started changing simultaneously that we may not have realized those things contributed to our mental health. It started with certain restrictions and limitations that we had to follow while we were in public, and that slowly turned into things starting to shut down. We went from learning in a classroom to learning through a computer screen. We went to waking up in the morning to go to work to waking up in the morning and working from home. We went from going out on the weekends to staying in our homes for weeks on end. And it's around this time when lockdown came, and I'm being overly dramatic here, but it was kind of like being in prison without actually being in prison. We couldn't freely go see our loved ones. We couldn't hang out with our friends. We couldn't go out. And even if we could, there wasn't really much for us to do out there anyways. If we wanted to work out to blow off some steam, we had to work out from home because all the gyms were closed. We were literally confined to pretty much the vicinity of our household. And we only really left when we needed some supplies or something from the store. And when we come back, we'd be back to square one within our four walls that we resided in. And this ended up being the perfect setting for us to get lost in our own minds, to allow our fears, our depression, and our anxiety to really start to sink its teeth in. A major destabilizing factor for me was being let go from this job that I actually really enjoyed. And the pandemic got so terrible that the company that I worked for couldn't afford to hold on to so many people, and they had to cut down to a bare bones staff just to keep itself afloat. And when I lost that job, I lost that last bit of routine that I had that kept me grounded and stabilized. Human beings are creatures of habit. We like to have routines. We like to have safety and stability. And when there's a huge fluctuation in any of those departments, let alone all of them, we really, really feel it. And then we begin to go into this little downward trend. Now, at the height of the pandemic, the media was really showing us the devastation that was being caused all over the world. And I remember particular images very vividly. For example, there was a particular point in time where hospitals had nowhere to store the bodies of the deceased, so they were putting them in the backs of refrigerated trucks. Now, I'm not the most religious person in the world, but I remember seeing those stories and those images and praying to God to keep all of my loved ones safe and not to take anyone away from me, because I don't know if I would have been able to handle it at that particular moment in time. And it's around this particular time where I'm having a tiny revelation on the fact that perhaps maybe I'm not doing as well as I think that I am. But then again, I'm in survival mode. I'm only focused on making it out in one piece. Now, what I just talked about is a great example of how the media that we consume affects our mental well-being. There's so many different kinds of stimulus out there that really genuinely affect us, and we may not even realize it because of the time and the era that we live in. Things like the content we consume, the environment we live in, the people we communicate with, all of these things combine and contribute to our mental health. Now, another example of the content we consume affecting us comes right after the peak time of the pandemic, during the time of which the Black Lives Matter movement was really starting to gain momentum. Now, this movement was an absolute wonder to watch unfold, but on the opposite side of that movement were people who didn't understand the reason as to why this movement was so important. And this one's definitely a me thing. I feel like I look into things a little too deeply and maybe I feel too much about certain things. But it was saddening to see people not get the point and not get the bigger picture and understand why it's important for people to be treated fairly and equally. But again, this one's probably just a me thing. Now, in my timeline of events, it's currently April, May of 2020, and every day since February, I've been waking up with this dark cloud over my head. I'm having difficulty finding motivation to even roll out of bed most mornings. I have no real drive to pursue any of the things that I've formerly been interested in. Most days I feel like I'm just existing with no real purpose because there was nothing really going on around me. Most nights I'm drowning in anxiety thinking about what am I going to do? What can I do? Is everything going to be okay? When is this going to be over? Is tomorrow going to be the day where I wake up and somebody that I care about is no longer with us? What happens if I get sick? Will I be able to survive? What if I get someone else sick? What if they don't make it? I feel like my life is just ticking away day by day by day, and there's nothing that I could do to make it any better. There's nowhere that I can go to keep my mind off of things. There really isn't much for me to do to keep my mind occupied. I look forward to going to bed because hopefully when I wake up, it'll all have been a bad dream and everything will have gone back to normal, but it never did. So I continued to retreat into this solitary confinement, which was only made easier by the lockdown restrictions, and it provided me with a great excuse as to why I wasn't reaching out or why I wasn't hanging out with anybody. Because it was a pandemic, we were all supposed to stay away from each other, right? So it was a great excuse to shut myself down even further and just stay in survival mode. I wasn't eating normally either, and when I did eat, I was eating things that were terrible for me. So it's only natural that I gained weight, and then because of that gain weight and the shift in my lifestyle, I would feel disgusted with myself, and then in turn, to feel better, I would make more bad decisions, eat more bad food, continue to have a super sedentary existence, which would cause me to feel disgusted with myself, which would continue the cycle over and over and over again, exponentially getting worse after each and every rotation. Now, at this point, I still had no clue on how deep I had fallen into this negative mental state, into this negative existence. I just assumed this to be the new temporary norm, and whatever it was that I was going through, that I would shake it off eventually. I finally realized how far I'd fallen a little over halfway into 2020, and that's because at this point, we reached one of my favorite few times of the year. And for those of you guys that don't know, I'm a summer baby. I was born in July. I love the heat. I absolutely love summertime. Maybe it's because I associate summertime with great vibes, people going on vacation, spending time with friends and family, barbecues, etc., etc. However, for the majority of the summer, I still struggled. I thought that once summer rolled around, I would spring back into life, but it wasn't that easy. Oftentimes, it felt like something was weighing me down. But the good thing is that I'd finally realized I wasn't content on the position that I was in at that moment, and that for me to get back to where I needed to be was going to take a lot of work. So I began to force myself into new routines to break old habits. I started taking on more activities. I started working out again. I started being more creative again. And some days I would recognize shades of my former self, and other days it would feel like trying to climb up a slippery slope only to end right back where I started. Ultimately, I kept at it. I would beat myself up on some days, and I'd also pick myself up on other days. A few more months passed where I rolled with the punches. I had a few things hit me out of left field, had a death in the family. I even ended up catching COVID myself, which I'll talk about at some other point. But for a really long time, I worked on getting myself back to a point of stability. I worked on improving my mental health. I knew that the climb back would be a long and arduous journey, but hey, everyone loves a good comeback story, which brings us to today. It's currently Mental Health Awareness Month, and I thought I'd share my recent experiences in an effort to get more people out there to really reevaluate their own relationships with mental health. Everyone has a different experience, and everyone deals with things a little bit differently. Mental health is a complex issue, and just because it might be difficult for some of us to talk about it, it doesn't change the fact that we all go through something at some point in time. And as far as mental health and how far it's come in the mainstream, I still don't feel like it's come far enough. Mental health needs to be addressed more often in our laws and our bills. It needs to be incorporated into our healthcare system as well as our educational system. There needs to be more resources available to those that are struggling and also for those that are trying to help. Taking care of your mental health has to be more than just an occasional checkup on yourself or your loved one. It has to become a common, approachable routine with a wide array of resources available to anybody that needs them. This is how we break old recurring cycles. This is how we get rid of toxic mentalities. This is how we as human beings can begin to live better, healthier lives. I'll leave some resources down below for some of you guys that might need them. Some of you guys may not have an avenue of communication with someone else out there, but if you really feel like you need to talk to someone about something, feel free to reach out. It's always been a life goal of mine to try and help as many people as I possibly can ever since I was a little kid. So if you're struggling, don't struggle in silence. Feel free to reach out. And as for the rest of you guys, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys take a moment to reevaluate your own relationships with mental health. And in any case, it feels absolutely amazing to be back. My name's Rubbie, and that's Real Talk. I'll see you next time. Peace.